plan. We look a little strange. Peter Fairweather has the microphone attached to his shirt, and I'm using it. That's why we're sort of huddled up here. I'd like to introduce Peter Fairweather for those of you who have not met him or come to earlier meetings. Peter's been working with a steering committee here in Montpelier for the past 6 months or so to try to develop a process whereby we come up with a draft economic development plan, which is what you're going to see tonight, and respond to and ask questions and kind of react to before it gets presented to City Council tomorrow evening. So this is Peter Fairweather, and he's going to carry on.
Great. Thank you, Jean.
You're welcome.
As soon as I get this back where it was. Okay, that should do it, right? We're good? All right. Thank you all for coming on this balmy spring day. And, you know, Jean set out the process right. What we're going to be doing is going through kind of the conceptual approach we're going to take to strategic planning for economic development in Montpelier, as based on the work we've done thus far. And I will give you a sense of the agenda. We'll first just do an overview of the planning process. Then we'll talk a little bit about what is economic development, what is an economic development strategy, what is Montpelier's strategic position, and then start talking about what are the opportunities and how should we pursue those opportunities. So, in terms of the planning process, Julie mentioned the steering committee, and these are the esteemed members of the steering committee, many of who are here tonight, and I'd like to thank them for their ongoing support. A lot of the work they did was to review drafts to make sure that they more or less made sense. And also, they were invaluable in putting me in contact with important stakeholders in the city and beyond, so that we could get a variety of different perspectives in the strategic planning process. And, you know, they're set up with 4 phases in the process: the analysis, the engagement, and this is where we started to talk to folks about what they saw as issues and opportunities. And then phase 3 is we started to talk about conceptually, how do we approach economic development in Montpelier? What is the overall strategic direction we're going to look at? And then the last phase is action, putting together the strategic plan. And, you know, we are here. We're finishing the creation process for the strategy. And what we're going to talk about tonight is kind of the general overall approach that we're recommending. And then from there, depending on the response and review, we'll put together the final plan, which will have an action agenda in sequenced order, metrics, and all the details to make this stuff happen. So what is economic development? It's stimulating or channeling economic activity, which could be spending, job creation, investment, so that activity preserves and improves a community's quality of life. Economic development harnesses economic power, but it isn't economic power. You know, that's the tricky thing about this process. We're looking for ways to facilitate economic activity in the city. And effective economic development depends upon market realities and motivated business people. And, you know, what we've tried to do in this process, and what we do in all the work related to economic development that I do, is to try to understand what are the market opportunities and how can those be engaged in the community to build opportunity, investment, jobs, and so forth. And what is an economic development strategic plan? It's a plan that defines an approach to use the resources we have to capture the activity we want. You know, that we've looked at what are the things that are happening from an economic perspective in Montpelier, what are the assets that the community has, and how can we mobilize those to take advantage of economic activities to generate the outcomes that we want. And, you know, part of this is saying, well, what's Montpelier's strategic position? What's the overall approach we're going to take to bring this about? What do we see as the opportunities? And what should we do to take advantage of those opportunities from the position that the city occupies? And now we're going to start to make that a little bit more specific. Let's talk about Montpelier's strategic position. And the model we've used to think about this is, that some of you have seen already, is called the process of market polarization, which I will lay out for you. And this is an important concept in our strategic planning process here in Montpelier. This model, it works from top to bottom. Again, some of you have seen it before. And it shows how markets grow and develop. And I'll walk you through an example, and then we'll apply it to Montpelier. The typical example is the automobile industry. Henry Ford figures out how to mass produce automobiles. So the inventor fills a need. Parity competition enters and expands the market. Chrysler and General Motors also come in and basically do the same thing. You know, they're providing a similar kind of product. Maybe the fins are shaped a little differently, the fenders are, you know, a little, but basically it's the same sort of thing. Step 3 is the important one. The extremes enter and are disregarded. Suddenly people show up in the market that are offering superior quality products, you know, like BMW or Jaguar or something like that, or lower price products, you know, Volkswagen, Nissan, and so on. And what happens is the big 3 automakers think, well, we're the dominant thing in the market, so we can ignore what's happening at the extremes. Then what happens is polarization accelerates. Consumers realize, well, I could have the standard issue car, or I could spend a little bit more money to get something that's really neat and cool, or spend a little less money and still get the same basic transportation. So if you stay in the middle in that situation, you lose. And if you remember, you know, the auto industry in the 70s and 80s, the big 3 automakers were sort of in a panic because they were suddenly lost their dominant position. And the same thing happens with locations. You know, that you can be a low-cost location in that the location itself helps minimize the cost of operations because rents are cheaper and so on, labor is cheaper, or superior quality. The location itself adds value to the enterprise. It's a productive place to do business because there are skilled workers here. There's a high quality of life that enables you to attract and retain workers more effectively. So that's the situation we're looking at in terms of Montpelier can be summarized by looking at what's going on in 2 neighbors as an example. When you look at Barrie and their approach to street economic development in their documents, retain and build on Barrie City's heritage as a blue-collar community that is affordable for working-class families. So they're clearly positioning themselves as a low-cost location for economic development. At the same time, what's happening over in Waterbury is they're positioning themselves as this place of uncommon ideas, a premium location for economic development. And what's interesting in this process is Montpelier, which, you know, 30 years ago was kind of the just about the only lively urban setting in central Vermont, now suddenly finds itself in the middle. And so it looks like there's a need to start thinking about what is our position in the marketplace, how do we respond? And this, some of you have seen this data before. This will give you a sense of what's going on. This looks at employment from basically the trends from 2009 to 2014, which is the most recent data for the full year we can get. It shows Montpelier, Barrie, and Waterbury. If you look at total employment, you can see Montpelier is bigger. The change in total employment, well, Montpelier gained 600 jobs, Barrie 650, and Waterbury lost 1,200. So Montpelier looks pretty good in comparison, except when you start to look at private sector jobs and take government out of the picture. Private employment, about 6,000 in Montpelier, 4,000 in Barrie, almost 3,000 in Waterbury. Over the last 5 years, the change in private sector employment in Montpelier, 10 jobs, as opposed to 400 in Barrie and 300 in Waterbury. So that, you know, there's movement that's taking place nearby, and Montpelier hasn't really participated that in the same extent. So we need to start thinking about what is Montpelier's position in the marketplace, and what will happen if you stay in the middle in that situation. If the community decides to stay in the middle, the economy will be growing slowly for the foreseeable future. And that's the other thing that makes this complicated. But if you look at what's happening at the national level, the growth rate, to give you a sense, and this is from a study from the Congressional Budget Office, the national growth rate In the 80s, which was not exactly boom times, you know, it was considered a somewhat slow-growing time, it was about 3% per year. The Congressional Budget Office now projects like over the next 10 to 20 years, average annual growth nationally will be 2%. You know, 2/3 of what it was in the 1980s. So the national growth is going to continue to be slow, and that's reflected in Vermont. You know, the New England Economic Partnership forecast last year, it said the pace of recovery and expansion will continue to be moderate. And again, so this is a time of slow growth. So if Montpelier doesn't respond, what happens? And I think it's important to remember that it's not like there's going to be an immediate cataclysm that you step out onto Main Street or in Stonecutter's Way one day and suddenly there'll be nothing there tomorrow. But what will happen is you'll see the population will continue to decline, little new housing is built, the retirees will stay put, housing remains rare and expensive for younger workers. The state consolidates its Montpelier workforce in fewer buildings in order to save a little money, freeing up downtown commercial space. A stagnant population means retail and hospitality businesses struggle and become more seasonal because they have to wait for people to come in from the outside because the resident population is slowly getting smaller and smaller. And the cost of government services rise and taxes go up, making the city less attractive to new businesses because there's fewer and fewer households and other kinds of businesses to cover the costs of running the city. And there's reduced capacity for regeneration or transition. You know, as we talk about how do we respond to the changing economy, the changing energy situation, and so on, in order to respond to that, we're going to need resources and wealth. And if we decide not to move and we stay in that middle position, you know, we see a slow decline, which again won't seem like a cataclysm. It'll seem more like things get a little cloudy in Montpelier. And then over 5 to 10 years, you suddenly see, gee, how did this happen? You know, there are a lot of empty storefronts here that didn't used to be that way. It's getting harder and harder to find work. And again, it's nothing that happens dramatically, but it's gradual over time. And that's why it's a good time to do this strategic plan right now, because there are many things that are going quite well for Montpelier. So we need to think about, given this change and the market polarization that's taking place, what do we do? So based on the work we've done this far, here's the overall approach we're suggesting. First of all, in terms of how do we think about, you know, what are the goals of this strategy? It's to increase economic activity, private sector jobs, and population by providing value to local businesses through a four-pronged approach. And we're going to talk about what's involved in each of these approaches in a little more detail than just this slide. We first need to support key sectors that can drive the economy. And we'll talk about what those are. Next, to champion transformational projects that strengthen the local economy, to be able to show that Montpelier can get the job done in terms of competing as a premium location for economic development. And we'll talk about what those could look like. To make strategic investments to strengthen the economy, and to assemble the tools to sustain the effort, catalyze projects, and build quality of life. And now what I'm going to do is to walk you through conceptually what each of those four elements would look like. First of all, supporting key market sectors. And these, you know, we've listed them alphabetically based on the analysis that we've done, which you can see a lot of that on the website, montpelierplan.com. These are industries that we see have growth potential in Montpelier. Listed alphabetically: adult learning, food processing and advanced manufacturing, and that is manufacturing that uses technology either in their processes or in their products. Entrepreneurs, particularly in software development and IT. Finance and insurance, historically a strength for the state capital and still very much so. Not-for-profit services, professional business and technical services, including green businesses, specialty retail, and tourism, hospitality, and the arts. So these we see as important sectors with growth potential for Montpelier in the future. Okay, and the other thing I'll point out, that little golden triangle will appear in these slides as a reminder. You were thinking about a premium positioning for Montpelier, and that's kind of the effort we're going to focus on. So championing transformational projects. And we'll give you some examples, some illustrations of what could be transformational projects for the city. Thinking about those sectors. How do we take advantage of the growth in those sectors? For example, creating a hotel and conference center, which might mean working with existing operators and or developers to create additional rooms and conference space to support business and tourism travel. And which of those sectors would that help? Tourism, hospitality and the arts, adult learning, finance and insurance, not-for-profit services and services, including green businesses. That idea of providing opportunities for conferences, for functions, and even just for business travel, in addition to the obvious target of tourism and the arts. So that's the first kind of transformational project. Second, a comprehensive parking strategy to ensure employees have access to parking, to reduce problems associated with the legislative session, to accommodate tourist visitation. In a previous analysis, one of the important things that employers look for when they're evaluating a location is to make sure that their employees have access to parking. So, part of this would be to put together a strategy to address the issues of what's the capacity, where is it needed, in what form. And that could be anything from, the bricks and mortar of a parking garage to looking at pricing parking in different parts of the city to make sure people distribute themselves in a way that's more effective and provides better opportunities for businesses to find their employees places to park and for retail operations to have a place for their customers to be. Other potential projects provide a variety of housing types to ensure adequate housing for what's termed in consultant land as the talent pipeline, and that is the workforce in the community. And that could include executive housing in the downtown and other locations, housing for young professionals with families, first-time home buyers, senior housing for retirees to free up existing housing stock, and affordable housing for young singles and others. And some of the sectors that helps particularly are finance and insurance, the services, including green business. The companies that are using high-skilled technical workers, the whole question of housing is an important ingredient in their development as they look to recruit talent, to bring workers in, to make sure that they can compete on the basis of the skills of their workforce. Another potential project is to create a not-for-profit advocacy training center. The Montpelier is the state capital, and there's some inherent advantage of that in terms of working with the not-for-profit sector and advocacy groups to build their capacity to do their work. This is a great place to observe the legislative process, to get a sense of how the agencies work and the rulemaking process and so on. And we think there's some opportunities to create this kind of training center which serves the not-for-profit services, obviously, but also adult learning and tourism, hospitality, and the arts. A lot of those operations are not-for-profits, especially in the arts sector. A venue featuring locally crafted food, wine, and spirits to, again, capturing the whole local food movement that's increasingly an important part of the Vermont economy, the central Vermont economy. There are a lot of opportunities, we feel, to look at ways to encourage those kinds of activities to benefit the food processing and advanced manufacturing and specialty retail sectors. Others, a retail arcade with small footprint spaces for startup retailers in a larger space in the town to basically see if there's a spot to create anything from stalls to small shops to enable retail businesses that are looking to get started to kind of get their operations underway without having to lease a full storefront, to test the idea, to test the concept. And there are a lot of communities that have successful spaces like this. One that comes to mind is in Northampton, Massachusetts. The Thorne Building is a good example where there's a variety of spaces of different size. And the sectors that could help, obviously retail, but also tourism, hospitality, and the arts, food processing and advanced manufacturing, but particularly food processing in this case, for processors that are looking for a small retail space to get their goods to market. Broadband connectivity to key growth sites. And the targeted sectors this would help are services, entrepreneurs, and adult learning. And actually probably just about every business these days could benefit from broadband activity in the downtown. So we see that as an important part of the positioning of Montpelier. So those are examples of some transformational projects that will signal that Montpelier is making that repositioning to a premium location. To go along with those are also some strategic investments that can be made either by government or the private sector to get the city ready to participate. And these could include creating Class A office space in downtown and the Barry Street Stonecutters Way area for professional services, entrepreneurs, and not-for-profits, create sites for food processing, and second stage advanced manufacturing in the Barry Street Stonecutters Way area. You know, there's a way in which Montpelier is, for example, more expensive than Barry, so the incubator kinds of activities, especially for manufacturing and food processing, may go to Barry. But once those companies grow and they're looking for, well, where do we go next to really sustain ourselves, there I think will be opportunities for Montpelier. Again, helping create that hotel and conference center in or adjacent to the downtown core, creating family housing in larger parcels in and adjacent to existing neighborhoods, and creating infill housing in the downtown core for young singles. You know, there are ways that these can be encouraged and to get private sector to participate in getting these kinds of investments to happen. Ensure adequate employee parking at each site. Again, that's repeatedly came up in the analysis of what makes a downtown attractive for business is for businesses to know that their workers have places to park. And then also to ensure pedestrian and bike connections to development sites for a couple of reasons. It helps in terms of the mobility of customers, but also the idea of quality of life is important for employers to sell a community to their workers, to say, this is the kind of place where you could bike to work. You know, that's an attractive thing, and we would look to encourage those kinds of investments. And also provide expeditious project reviews. First of all, I've always wanted to use the word expeditious in a sentence, and this was my chance to do that. But, you know, are there ways to increase the predictability of project reviews? And, you know, developers, that's what they want, a predictable process. The answer can be no, but they want to know that it'll take X number of months or X number of weeks to get there, and that the process itself will be understandable and they can reliably expect what each step will be. One of the ways the Montpelier can consider to do that is to adapt the Municipal Administrative Procedures Act for projects, which basically puts project reviews more or less on the record, and when if the project is appealed to the environmental court, what the environmental court then does is look at the decision-making process that the local government used to make sure that it was done in a way that was sensible, that wasn't arbitrary and capricious, and made the best use of the information that was provided, rather than having to start the whole review all over again. So the idea is, again, not essentially to make sure that the process is high quality, but also gets done in as effective a time frame as possible. And strengthening community amenities. Streetscapes, facades, recreational facilities. You know, these are good things to do from a civic pride point of view, but when you're thinking about competing, especially for skilled firms that use skilled labor, it's important to have a quality of life that's exemplary. And this is something, the good news is Montpelier can build upon, you know, basically an attractive community to start with. This is a place that has a lot of this. We need to sort of put a fresh coat of paint on some things, and also make sure that the amenities that are being provided keep pace with other communities that are in the marketplace also. Marketing. Another important investment is once we've got all this stuff going, to make sure the word gets out. And some of that is to build a brand for the economic development strategic plans to indicate there's stuff going on here, this is an interesting place. Provide personal service for business development approvals and financing. To have someone to serve as sort of a friend and a broker with businesses, to just get them through the process so that they understand, you know, what is the paperwork I have to submit, what are the grants and loans that I might be eligible for, and so that they feel that they're getting support from the city in a systematic way. Because a lot of that stuff happens now. but it's divided between 3 or 4 different offices, and it's very easy for things to fall through the cracks that way. And then lastly, recruit firms in the target industries to Montpelier, especially once the situation is in place where the community is known even more for its ever higher quality of life. There are interesting things going on here. Then even to get the word out through peer networks. You know, the people that employers in town know that are elsewhere is the most effective way to get the word out to companies to think about Montpelier. If you hear from somebody that's in your business, that maybe is a supplier or even a competitor, this is a great place to do business. They really work with you. They make sure that you get the assistance you need. It's a great place. They're great schools, a good quality of life. That's some of the most effective marketing, if it's coming from their peers rather than brochures. So now item number 4, we talked about investments. Now let's just talk quickly about assembling the economic development tools. And we got a few things here. First of all, tools to catalyze key projects. To build partnerships with developers and property owners, almost like creating a round table to meet regularly with the development community and property owners to see what's going on, what are you thinking about. We've got, I've heard from these kinds of businesses that are looking to come into the city. Any of you folks interested, do you have the space that would work for these folks? And in this case, the column on the right-hand side shows who would the partners be with an economic development agency that's working in the city. And, developers in city government would be working with the economic developer. Create grant and financing packages for partner developers to produce projects that can be priced from Montpelier. One of the things we've heard a lot from a lot of different sources, and when you hear this, you'll see it makes pretty much common sense. The cost of building something is pretty much the same in Burlington as it is in Montpelier. You're using the same wood, the same sheetrock. You're basically using the same workforce employed at the same wages. The rent that you can get in Burlington is higher than what you can get in Montpelier right now. So if you're a developer, where are you going to go? And so what we need to do to start thinking about is, can we put together packages to help bring those costs down for the developers so that they can price it so it'll sell in Montpelier, but they'll still make some money on it. So they'll say, this project worked, let's do another one. And again, that's where we see coordinating with city government, appropriate federal, state, and local agencies. And then the other side of that, is to also think about long-term an annual fee for vacant buildings. And this is sort of a mixture of carrot and stick. The idea is to lead with the carrot and to try to make these programs as attractive and create as much of an incentive for developers and property owners as possible. But, if that still doesn't work, then there may be a need to put in a bit of a carrot, a bit of a stick rather, to say here's another additional incentive of a different kind to get you to think about moving your properties and getting them occupied again. Tools to improve amenities and infrastructure. Again, the parking strategy is important in terms of thinking about how do we move vehicles and people through the city in a way that supports economic development, maintains and improves quality of life, and that involves, city government, appropriate federal, state, and local agencies. Streetscape improvements, again, putting the best foot forward for the city, and even possibly using tax increment financing to support public infrastructure improvements. And that requires the work with the state legislature to empower that, but basically tax increment financing enables a project to be done such that some of the tax revenues from that project, some of the new revenues coming in, are actually dedicated to retiring bonds that might be used to extend a sewer line, build some broadband infrastructure, and so on. So we're getting a little wonky here and a little bit into the weeds explaining that, but that's the general idea. And then lastly, as part of tools to sustain the effort, to create a lead economic development entity. And you can see up there, this is at least a 5-year commitment. getting this, doing this reposition and getting firmly into the golden part of the pyramid, it requires sustained effort. So we're looking at how do we create an entity to carry this forward, be accountable for it, and make sure it keeps moving. One of the things we're looking at is a local development corporation, and you can see we're listing advantages and disadvantages of that. On the advantage side, it provides maximum accountability for the plan through a contract in the city. Who's responsible for this? It's the LDC. Ensures continuity across election cycles because it's a multi-year contract. It's separate from the city government, so there's more administrative flexibility. And it also can accommodate private sector participation a little bit better. It's easier to do, maintain confidentiality. It's also easier, if the opportunity comes along, to accept private sector support to enhance the activities of the corporation. There are some disadvantages. There are startup costs. You've got to create bylaws, board has to be constituted, creating policies for the organization. There are all reporting requirements. It seems like there's more every day in terms of what's required from federal and state government. And it also adds another organization in the city. So what we're looking at, and this is something as we come down to the final part of this, we'll be finalizing a recommendation about what's the best way to move this forward. Again, it might be a local development corporation, but it might be using an existing organization. It might be creating a position or entity within city government. But we need to look a bit more at the details of this. The key takeaway on this, though, is it's at minimum a 5-year commitment to get this project working. As we think about this, sort of summarizing it, the strategic position, maybe we can think of this, Montpelier is the innovative capital of Central Vermont. It's the state capital. It's an innovative municipal government. It's the single biggest repository of creative assets in Central Vermont, and it's the hub for innovative enterprises in the region. And so to think about the strategic plan as the innovative capital strategy, and maybe the projects can be thought of as part of this long-term strategic plan, the innovative capital strategy. Because again, this is something where the projects are going to be rolling out over a 5 to maybe 10-year time period in a sustained program. So this is the one slide summary of everything I've just talked about. But I want to put that up because at this point, we'll take comments, questions, reactions. Maybe turn on the slide. So if any questions, comments, reactions. Yes.
I believe that we are the innovative capital. I think that's one thing that makes Montpelier really juicy and why people like to come, and there's a diversity and there's a life to it. But in this plan, I don't see a lot of innovation. I see a concentration on parking and the use of, it's not very green friendly. It doesn't seem very innovative to me. It doesn't, in large part, call for the engagement of the community. For example, you talk about food processing. I think that's a great idea. Why not have model farming or gardens so that our food sources are closer to the center of the community? Why not have a transportation system that takes parking out of the city and people, there's an innovative way to move people into the heart of Montpelier. Of course, the riverfront development, that could be a whole big area of innovation. Mm-hmm. So that's just kind of my first take on it, that it needs, this is pretty cut and dry to me. And then I want to bring up, of course, I'm from Onion River Exchange, mm-hmm. which supports an alternative economy, and it's a social economy where community members help each other. And they help each other by fulfilling basic needs to be met. And that would be an interesting component to develop, because I believe that would draw people into the community, or it could be an organized way that for a community to be helping itself.
Okay. A couple of responses, though. I think, in terms of parking, when we're looking at a parking strategy, I don't think it necessarily eliminates the things that you're talking about. But one of the things we have to do is make sure that when the strategy we come up with is something that the businesses can live with. Bottom line, that's where we are. I think there's some opportunities long-term to think about what would Montpelier look like, in a low-carbon, zero-carbon situation. And I think that's part of being the innovative capitalist, to look at that. But in the short term, we really have to look at, all right, how do we accommodate the businesses here with the needs that they have? And, that strategy could include a variety of things, some of which might include the shuttle system and so on. The other thing in terms of the community involvement and agriculture, I'll deal with those simultaneously, is this is just the start of the process. And I think that there will be opportunities throughout the implementation process. That's where you really engage the business folks. You sort of say, these are the things, we're ready to support. And we'll do that in any way that makes sense. And food processing, that industry, the local food movement, is really just starting. So we've got a sense of some things that might be possible now, but 5 years from now, it could be some of the initiatives that you just mentioned come to the fore. And I think that at that point, when the market is ready to do that, the city's got to be ready to respond as well. So I wouldn't, I would love to say that, I've got all kinds of fancy bells and whistles in this plan, but I think what it does, in terms of being innovative, the idea is to try to set the table where innovation can take place.
It's just, I didn't, when you were outlining the transformational projects, I didn't hear any of that echoed.
Okay, well, that wasn't an exhaustive list of projects.
Okay.
But those were some of that came out of the discussions. And again, as we go forward, and if a project shows up where there's a business plan that suggests it's viable, then I think it can go, and the economic development organization can support it. Other comments?
One of the biggest problems I see is development is so important, but the people that live in Montpelier don't want to see development happening in their backyard, like for instance Savings Pasture. How is it that we can convince the community how important it is to bring in more development and more housing without having always constantly battling against just
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm going to answer it from down here. First of all, there are always going to be situations where a project is going forward and the people next to it don't like it. But that doesn't mean it's bad for the city. One of the things we're looking to get out of this economic development process is a vision for the direction we're heading, such that, if a project comes forward that's been identified as part of the innovative capital strategy, let's use that phrase, people will show up to support it. Because that's the other part of this process, is there should be a notion that there's some projects that are worth supporting. Because there'll always be a small opposition to almost anything. I mean, I could name, or you could design an ideal project that fits everything I stand for in terms of economic development, and you put it in the property next to mine, and I'll show up at this, the city council meeting, cranky as all heck. So, but I think what's needed is a shared vision about how we move forward and what it's going to take. Because again, when you look at that whole market polarization idea, which I think is really at work here, standing still is not an option. Standing still just leads to a slow crumbling of all the good stuff that Montpelier has to offer. Yes, sir.
Talking about the advantages of Montpelier being a capital city.
The advantages of Montpelier being a capital city?
Are there any advantages?
Yeah, I mean, There are some. In terms of the restaurant and retail trade during the day, there's a lot of, the net in-migration of people coming in is very strong. Secondly, state government employment is stable. So that you're not in a situation like if Montpelier was Detroit, for example, and you go up and down with the automobile industry. The employment situation in Montpelier, largely, or at least somewhat because of state government, is relatively stable. That being said, because there are some advantages, it would be a mistake to rely on state government to even play the same role in the future that it has in the past, because it's not going to be funded at the same level. All indications are. The workforce is aging, and as it retires, there are going to be opportunities probably to do some attrition. So it's important to develop and diversify the private sector of Montpelier, even though having state government here is an asset. I mean, I know that seems sort of heretical in some ways, but it does some good things for the city.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Two things. One is I'd be interested to have you talk about how this overlays with a lot of existing initiatives that we're in the midst of right now, and quite honestly, past consultants' plans that are still in a cupboard somewhere. And the other thing I think that fits in a couple of places up here would be dealing with energy use and housing. I mean, that strategic investment, it's a key sector. If you look at the amount of money that goes out of this town just to pay for fuel oil, what can we do to keep that in here that provides job and stability?
Yeah, and this is probably shorthand on my part, but the green services, I'm including energy as part of that, for some of the reasons you just indicated. But also, dealing with the questions of energy and environmental protection is becoming very sophisticated technologically. And I think to the extent to which Montpelier is seen as the place where there's interesting green stuff going on, there's opportunities for technology-related businesses to come in related to that. And there was another...
Well, how does this fit in and overlay with existing initiatives?
That's going to be part of the implementation process. The idea here is we've tried to do something that, first of all, could be used as a chapter in the master plan for the city. So that's bringing that together. But there are a lot. One of the strengths of Montpelier is there's a lot of community activism, which means there's like 7,000 committees. So, I don't know all of them, to be perfectly honest, but the idea behind this is it's to help inform the work of those committees. That's part of this process, is to, it's not necessarily that everybody suddenly becomes an economic developer, but when they're thinking about what's going on and how do we address our work, remember, we're the innovative capital, and we've got to think about this other stuff as well. And maybe eventually there'll be some, much more elaborate coordination. But that's how we start. Yes?
I'm assuming you've done this for a number of other localities. And I'm wondering, for those success stories, if you will, that after you go through this process and presented all these ideas and strategies, what do you see as, in those cities where they've seen a lot of success afterwards, what are the biggest barriers that they've had to overcome in order to achieve that success?
Well, let me turn it around, because the strengths are leadership and tenacity. That's because they're going to run into barriers. Everybody runs into barriers. Sometimes it's ourselves, but it's just, we're going to do this, and we're going to keep moving forward. All right, we've got 3 things to do, and this first one fell apart. Okay, we're doing the second one. And you just move forward. And I think that's particularly critical for Montpelier in the situation, because we're talking from a time of relative strength and capacity here. And there's a strong citizen sector here. So we need to build that leadership and that commitment to a shared direction. And this is intended to be the start of that process. And that's what they all have in common. There was a community, I can't take credit for this, but it's really a good lesson in the Adirondacks that really did a lot. North Creek, I don't know if you know North Creek, but they really revitalized their tourism sector. One of the ways they did it is there was this thing called the Friday Morning Club, or whatever it was. And the supervisor of the town said, it's the one meeting I'll never miss. Because they met every Friday morning at this diner, and they talked about the plan and how do we go forward. And that's what it's going to take here is a sustained effort to say, all right, what are we doing this week? Here's the plan. Here are the 3 things we're working on this year. It's not 11. Here are the 3 major things. Where are we? What do we have to do next?
So, follow-up question.
Sure.
Is that leadership embodied within a local development corporation, or is that leadership that's seen more in the municipality?
I'll tell you, the role of the local development corporation, or whatever structure you use, is to free that leadership. It's difficult for the economic development person to sort of set themselves up as the leader, but there's a leadership cadre here. And the role of that economic development organization is to cultivate that leadership, let them know it's okay for them to take charge of this and help them move forward. And this is a community that knows how to do stuff. So that is possible here. Yes.
I was wondering, when you developed your plan, did you look at the physical, this is sort of a 2-part question, did you look at the physical restraints within Montpelier, i.e. we're not a terribly big plot of land here. A lot of our land that might be good for economic development is in the floodplain, so there's real big restrictions there. And I guess the second part is thinking about the physical location. I didn't see anything in there about taking advantage of recreational tourism and recreational opportunities. Do you think that Montpelier is pretty much out of the loop on that? That sort of Stowe's got a corner on that, and some of the northern locations, or do you think there's an opportunity?
I think there is an opportunity. I mean, and it may not be the ski.
Right.
Especially in this past winter, that may not be a good idea anyway. But, this is a community where, the infrastructure for biking and other kinds of recreation is being completed. And it's a pretty easy sell to say this is a community that participates in outdoor recreation. We haven't even looked really, and this is something long-term, the role of the rivers in all that. The communities are more and more discovering, kayaking and all these things that can happen on rivers that, most people couldn't even name in their communities. So yes, recreation is part of that tourism, hospitality, and the arts sector. Recreational tourism is part of it. The other thing I want to get back to is, there's a lot of constrained land in Montpelier. So we have to think in terms of incremental steps, a diversity of businesses. This is not going to be one of those things where we're going to attract one 2,000 person firm that's going to suddenly save everything. It's important to retain the large employers that the city has, but you'll see in terms of the growth, it's small. It might be 5 to 10 employee firms that that's where the growth is going to come from.
I think I saw you targeting Berry Street and Stonecutter Road.
Yeah.
Those are the 2 primary areas that you consider growth potential?
Well, growth potential for the business services, the green services, because there's good space there to do some office space, some new office space. But there's opportunities downtown for infill, for better use of the second floors. And the other part of economic development here is the housing element. I think it's really critical that housing is part of economic development because we need to build the population base, both in terms of making sure employers know that they have access to adequate workforce, but also so that the downtown businesses have a residential population that does business there as a way of keeping them strong and avoiding just being tourism related. Yes.
Peter.
Yes.
First, I wanted to say, from this person's perspective, you and your committee have done an excellent job. It's a well-organized project and presentation, and it makes sense. I just wanted to speak a little bit about strategic investment. And the most significant strategic investment this city's done in 5 years has been in city streets and working on the abysmal city streets. But we still have sewer pipes and water mains that are 50 to 100 years old that haven't been addressed. In the last 5 years, we've invested less than $600,000 over 5 years in our water mains and in our sewer pipes, except for District 8. We have a liability there approaching perhaps $75 million. Is this really realistic to talk about facades and streetscapes before you devoted substantial resources to rebuilding our sewers and water?
Yeah, I don't think one excludes the other.
But one is so massive for a town of 7,500 people. Shouldn't that be addressed first? An organized plan for how we're going to address the true costs of water and sewer before we start talking about this. That's not to say this doesn't have merit.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know that you need to wait to do that. I think what you point out is an important issue to make sure that the capital needs are planned for and there's a program to address them. I think every community I know struggles with that. And the extent to which Montpelier gets ahead of the curve on that, which I don't know of any American community of any size that is ahead of a curve on this. That would be a competitive advantage. But you can't, I don't think Montpelier can wait on that to start thinking about what its economic future will be. But it also can't ignore that. Let's go to somebody who hasn't spoken yet.
Yeah, I would I like your focus on the entrepreneurship.
Okay.
Certainly if we're going to see private sector job growth, I think that's likely where it's going to come from. It's unlikely, traditionally we've had the state and insurance companies, but I don't know if we can rely on those growing at this point. As you said, it's hard to bring a big company in all of a sudden, so that really seems like a great place to start and get some businesses going, and maybe they build a building and build up the grand list, and that helps us pay for infrastructure needs. I was curious, so you specifically focused on software and IT. That seems like a very competitive area. Everybody wants that in their town.
Yep.
And you're competing against all these larger communities from Burlington to Silicon Valley. So, shouldn't the entrepreneurship be cast a broader net? And not focus just on that?
Yeah, the idea was that would be an important concentration, but not exclusively. And maybe it should be restated so it's even broader than what I've indicated here. But I take your point. But there is an existing entrepreneurial class in town right now dealing with those issues. Local 64 and people like that. So, I think there's some momentum there that could be tapped into already based on existing activity. But I stand corrected that it's not just those areas where there's entrepreneurial activity.
Follow up, one other thing I liked in your report was the idea of an entity, and I think the LDC is a good possibility. I looked at some of the statutes and what they can do, and it includes starting business incubators, and getting loans from the state to build buildings. So it has a lot of things it can do. I also believe they have LDCs in the two towns we used as examples, Waterbury and Barry. So maybe you could just address that or whatever you know about how it's worked out there.
Yeah, no, I think you've described the potential advantage as well, that there's some statutory powers that LDCs have that could be very useful. What I think the next step for us is to think hard about what the action plan is for economic development to move these things forward. What are the tools that are going to be required, and is the LDC the best? Because every community is different. Montpelier has its own distinct set of characteristics and idiosyncrasies, and we need to be sensitive to that, rather than just say, yep, LDC, it worked here, let's do it there. But I think it's an idea really worth considering. Yes, then we'll.
I was really interested to see the hotel and conference center on there. I'm one of the people who actually thought Montpelier should have built the hotel on the Dealer Street project, and was very disappointed when the city council decided not to do that. And I assume that you've been told about that history. So what I'm wondering is how that was a situation where there was a lot of local opposition, very much speared by the people who had a competing hotel. So So given that history, how much sense does it make to put that as a priority? Or maybe it does because you're talking about a different part of town, or you're talking about smaller things rather than one big hotel. How would we encourage the city council and the city leaders to stomach the idea of going forward with that idea?
Well, I think it's an important opportunity. One of the ways is to think about it in terms of, all right, do the existing hotel operators in town, are they interested in participating? Because it's an opportunity for them too, and if they're not, well, that's their choice, but then to think about, are there other ways to make that happen? Because it's my understanding now that Montpelier is losing out on events because there's not enough rooms for events to grow here. So we have to look at that. And, again, in an ideal world, for those of us committed to kind of local growth, it would be great to turn to an operator of a local establishment and say, let's talk about ways of building a new facility or expanding your facility to do this. But if that's not possible, then we need to look at other ways to do that. And it's likely, from what I understand of the hotel and tourism business, ultimately, if it's created, it will help the other hotels and lodging places in the community because there'll be more events, more demand for rooms all around. I see a lot of people nodding their heads, so I'm probably covering stuff that we've already heard. But anyway, that's how I see it. Now, let's go here and then here.
So I think it's been proven that really healthy cities are walkable cities, which is the reason why we need affordable housing for downtown. It supports young families, it supports the elderly. And so when I think of the development of Berry Street for office space, I think of perhaps office space should be out more on the fringes of Montpelier rather than in the center, where on the fringes you could perhaps accommodate parking more easily. And then if people need to get into town, there would be shuttles into town. I think we need to keep switching, that we keep needing to build office buildings in the center of town when it's really housing that we need in the center of town.
Well, I don't know that it's an either or proposition. Because part of what makes things walkable is if, like, in my hometown, I walk to work. I walk to my office. And both my house and the office are in basically the downtown sort of area. And I think there are opportunities to do that. There also can be situations where you've got office and housing in the same building. So, and all the principles of smart growth suggest that. And, you're right to talk about walkability as a key competitive advantage. So that when we're looking at these developments, the extent to which they can be made walkable continues to strengthen the competitive advantage Montpelier already has.
It's the idea that having office buildings and business development more on the outskirts is that you could deal with the parking more easily than burdening the downtown with additional
I think for large footprint office space, I think you're right. Yes, sir.
I just want to speak to that, the importance of having a mixture of residential and office. I work in City Center, and there's more than 50 of us in my office in a space that would maybe be 3 or 4 residential units. And so there's 50 plus of us every day at lunch who walk the streets of downtown and do our shopping and have lunch and walk. And I think probably, I don't want to malign my coworkers, but I would bet that most of them would not drive into downtown to shop and eat at restaurants and things like that. So there's quite a bit of value to having all of us right here in the downtown. You want the residential too, because you want people here at night, etc. But I think it's really important to have the mixture of the daytime workers and the housing.
Yeah, and that's an existing strength. One of the interesting things for me doing this project is that when I come into town, I pretty much park my car and then I walk to virtually all the meetings I have to go to. And I really enjoy that. I'm a big walker, so it works very well as a walkable community. Yes?
Peter, 2 things. First, I want to just underscore a point that Heather made at the beginning about the Onion River Exchange.
Okay.
I don't know if you're aware of it, but it is an organization with hundreds of members that are currently delivering services throughout the community, and could be a very important part of your development. The second, the topic of the river has come up. Actually, you even brought it up. And having moved recently to Hartford, Connecticut, which has been working hard for years to capitalize on the riverfront of the Connecticut River, modeling like Providence, what they've done with waterfront, or San Antonio. One thing that struck me when I moved to Montpelier was this river that wound right through the city, and there's absolutely no capitalization of that riverfront that I'm seeing here. Now, there may be a flow level issue that comes into play, because I know it does fluctuate in height, but I'm curious how that issue comes into play.
Yeah, it's something that might be better addressed in the larger comprehensive plan, the master plan, of which this would just be a chapter. But yes, they're amazing assets, the rivers in Montpelier. I'll never forget, and this was 1980, the first time I walked over the bridge and looked back at, which is where the bridge with the buildings, where you look, there's...
Rialto.
Yeah, and you look under it, and there's the river. And the first time I saw that, I just thought that was the coolest thing in the world. Other questions? Yeah, yes.
Comment on the potential value of the buildings across the street.
Potential value of the buildings across the street? They're potentially valuable. I mean, especially with, the opportunities for mixed-use development there, retail and either offices or apartments overhead. That's an important thing. I'll give you an example from work I did last year in Corning, New York, which is a downtown somewhat comparable to Montpelier, although Montpelier is nicer. They were amazed because, there's a company in town in Corning called Corning. Yeah, and 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the top executives at Corning all wanted to live in this place called Aurene, which was this housing development outside of town with 5 to 10 acre lots and these 4,000 square foot houses. You know the type. And now they all want to live above Main Street. They all want to live downtown. And I've mentioned this before, the locals can't believe it. They're saying, well, why do you want to live in downtown Corning? Because, they have a different perspective. These folks really want to be part of an urban scene. So these buildings are real assets. And, the time is ripe to sort of move them forward. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit more about the hotel and conference center?
Okay.
Because what I've heard is that there's a vacancy rate in the hotel rooms right now, about 30%. And then there's another hotel just within a mile that, I don't know, how do I say this in a respectful way? I mean, they're like, yeah, there's like, it used to be an old restaurant that's still, yes.
Okay, I know the place. Yeah.
And, like nothing's being done with that, and mattresses are being thrown outside. I mean, it's really...
Has a lot of potential.
It does have lots of potential.
Enormous potential.
And I'm wondering if the committee looked at that's still an existing vacancy rate, and then there's this place that has lots of potential and has a lot of space, really, unused space.
Yeah, yeah.
So...
Well, it's a question of the ability of that space to serve the market that represents the opportunity, which is kind of a little bit of the higher-end professional and conference space and tourists. The Econo-Lodge wasn't designed to do that. Its name suggests who it's appealing to. It's, the low-end traveler, having spent a number of nights in Econo-Lodges in my life. So that there's a situation where it would be difficult to convert that property to address the opportunity that the hotel and conference center represents. That being said, should the sector continue to grow, then eventually there may be an opportunity to redevelop that. In weird ways, in Lake George, New York, in Bolton Landing, which is kind of the she part of Lake George, there are a number of old motels. And they're not quite as big as the Econolodge, but of similar character. A lot of them right now, because that part has gone so upscale, families are buying the motels and using them as family compounds. Now, I don't know that that's going to happen. but just as the market evolves, new uses can be found. Other comments, questions? Well, let me take this opportunity to thank you for coming out on a blustery spring evening. We're going to be giving a short presentation also to the City Council tomorrow to give them an update on this. And if you thought this was fun, you can come again and do it. But again, thank you for coming out, and stay tuned. MontpelierPlan.com is the website where you can keep track on meetings and other things, and this is just the beginning of the process.
So after tomorrow night, what are the next steps?
Funny you should ask. Ta-da! Thank you. Then, assuming we've got sort of conceptual buy-in, then we've developed the full draft report, which outlines the strategic approach, recommends a structure for economic development, which includes the entity, LDC, and also potential partnerships. Who else can play in terms of financial institutions, state agencies, business groups, and so on. We're also going to try to put some estimated costs and returns and metrics in this, to say, if a job brings X number of dollars into Montpelier and, you attract 300 jobs, does that pay you back the investment that might be required to get this to work? And then an implementation plan, setting priorities, timelines, and again, metrics for completion. But thank you for cueing that for me.
Peter, can we ask you to do one thing when you present to the council, which is to repeat this gentleman's question and your answer about what are the two most important things for success?
Okay, sure.
Leadership and persistence, because I think that's a really important message for them to hear.
Yeah, and I think my sense of that it'll be well received. I think it's a language that they'll understand and they know about.
Time frame for these next steps?
Oh, probably August. No, I'm only kidding. Over the next month. We're looking, in a month to get this done. And, that's the good news. The bad news is that once this is done, then it's your turn to get started. All right. Well, again, thank you. Have a safe trip home.